Hi everyone, this is Natalia, and you're listening to Com English, Daily English. Today we want to talk about funny, everyday situations. Not jokes, not stories from movies, but real moments from life. The kind of moments that feel a little uncomfortable when they happen, but later make you smile. I want to start with something very simple. A situation that happens to many people, especially when we are tired or distracted. It was early in the morning, and I had a lot on my mind. I didn't sleep very well, and I was already thinking about my plans for the day. I went to a small shop near my home to buy a few things. Just bread and milk. Nothing complicated. I walked inside, smiled, and the cashier smiled back. She looked at me and said, "Hello, how are you?" And without thinking, I answered, "Thank you." You too. The moment I said it, I knew it was wrong. But the words were already out. There was a short silence. She looked at me, surprised, and then she smiled. I smiled too, a little embarrassed. I quickly said, "Oh, sorry." "I'm fine." We both laughed, and the moment passed. It wasn't a big mistake. Nothing bad happened. But inside, it felt bigger than it really was. That's how these situations work. In our heads, they grow very fast. But in real life, people are usually kind. They understand. Later, when I left the shop, I laughed at myself. I thought about how often we do this. We answer the wrong question. We say something automatic. We are polite, but our brain is somewhere else. These moments are part of everyday life. They happen at work, in shops, with friends, and with strangers. And they happen even more when we speak another language. But that doesn't mean we are doing something wrong. It just means we are human. And one day, these small mistakes become funny stories. Stories we tell later, with a smile.
Hi everyone, this is Daniel, and you're listening to Calm English, Daily English. Today we are sharing funny everyday situations, the kind of moments that feel small, but stay in your memory because they teach you something about yourself. I want to tell you about a moment that happened when I thought I was doing everything right. It was a normal afternoon, and I decided to stop at a cafe. I was tired, but in a good mood. I walked in, looked at the menu, and ordered a coffee. Just a coffee. Very simple. The barista was friendly and spoke quickly. She asked me a question. I heard the words, but my brain didn't connect them. Instead of asking her to repeat, I did what many people do. I smiled and said, "Yes." She looked at me for a second and asked again. I smiled again and said, "Yes." At that point, I had no idea what I was agreeing to. I just wanted the moment to move forward. Finally, she laughed and said, "For here or to go?" And suddenly, everything made sense. I laughed too and said, "Oh, sorry. For here." The situation ended with a smile, and my coffee arrived a minute later. I sat down and thought about how often this happens. We say yes because it feels polite, because we don't want to slow things down, because we don't want to look confused. But in reality, stopping for 1 second and asking a simple question can save us from these funny situations. Later, I smiled again, because the moment was not a problem. It was just life. A small reminder that we don't have to be perfect. We just have to be present. These moments are part of learning English, but they are also part of being human. We misunderstand. We hesitate. We laugh. And then we move on.
Hi everyone, this is Natalia, and we continue our Calm English Daily English Live Talk. Today we're sharing funny everyday situations, the kind of moments that are very normal, but still make us laugh later. I want to tell you about a situation that happened when I was being very organized. It was one of those days when you feel busy, but confident. I had a list in my head. I knew where I was going and what I needed to do. Or at least, I thought I knew. I went to a place where I had an appointment. I arrived on time, stood at the desk, and waited for my turn. Everything felt calm. When the woman behind the desk looked at me, she asked me a simple question. She asked for my name. Very easy, right? But instead of just saying my name, my brain decided to add stress. I said my name, then I added extra information that nobody asked for. I started explaining why I was there when I arrived and what I needed. I talked and talked, trying to sound confident, but inside I felt confused. She listened patiently and then smiled. She said, "That's okay. I just need your name." At that moment, I stopped. I laughed quietly and said my name again, slowly, clearly. Nothing bad happened. The situation was simple. But in my head, it felt much bigger. I realized that sometimes we talk too much because we are nervous. We want to sound sure. We want to show that we understand. But sometimes less is better. After that, everything went smoothly. The appointment was fine. The conversation was easy. And when I left, I felt lighter. I thought about how many times we make life more difficult than it needs to be. These small moments teach us something important. We don't need perfect English. We don't need long explanations. We don't need to impress anyone. Simple words are enough. Being calm is enough. Later, when I told this story to a friend, we laughed. Because everyone has moments like this. Moments when we overthink. Moments when we try too hard. Moments when we forget that it's okay to be simple. And that's what real life English is. Not perfect sentences. Just real moments, spoken slowly with a smile.
Hi everyone, this is Daniel. And we are continuing our Calm English Daily English Live Talk. Today we are sharing funny everyday situations, the kind of moments that happen quietly, without drama, but stay with you because they feel very human. I want to talk about a situation that happened when I thought I was being very polite. It was one of those moments when you want everything to go smoothly. I was walking into a small office to ask for some information. Nothing complicated. Just one short question. I walked in, smiled, and said hello. The person behind the desk smiled back and asked me how she could help. I listened carefully, nodded, and then she asked something I didn't expect. It was not a difficult question, but my brain suddenly went empty. I understood the words, but not the meaning together. Instead of saying, "Sorry, can you repeat that?" I did what felt safe. I nodded and said, "Okay." She looked at me and started explaining something very seriously. She talked for a long time. I listened, nodded again, and tried to follow. After a minute, I realized something important. I had no idea what we were talking about. Not even a little. But now it felt too late to stop. So I continued listening, hoping the situation would somehow fix itself. Finally, she stopped and asked, "Does that answer your question?" And that was the moment of truth. I took a breath and said, "Actually, I think I misunderstood. Can I ask again?" She smiled immediately and said, "Of course." I asked my question again, slowly this time. She answered in 2 simple sentences. That was it. The whole conversation could have taken 1 minute, not 10. When I left the office, I laughed quietly. Not because the situation was bad, but because it was so unnecessary. I made it complicated by trying to look confident instead of being honest. These moments teach us something important. We don't need to pretend. We don't need to understand everything immediately. It's okay to pause. It's okay to ask again. People are usually much kinder than we expect. Later, this situation became a funny story. One of those stories that remind you that learning. English is not about being perfect. It's about being real. And real life is full of small misunderstandings, small pauses, and small laughs. And that's what makes it interesting.
Hi everyone, this is Natalia, and we're still here with Calm English, Daily English. We're talking about funny, everyday situations, the kind of moments that don't feel funny right away, but later become part of your personal stories. I want to share a moment that happened when I was trying to be helpful. It was one of those days when you want to do everything right. I was in a public place, waiting in line, and the atmosphere was calm. People were quiet. Everyone was focused on their own thoughts. When it was my turn, the person in front of me looked a little confused. They didn't know where to go next. Without thinking too much, I decided to help. I stepped a little closer and said something simple. Something I thought was clear, but my words came out in the wrong order. The sentence sounded strange, even to me. The person looked at me, then looked around, and then asked me to repeat. I repeated the sentence, but it didn't sound better the second time. At that moment, I felt that familiar feeling, the one where your mind starts to race. You think about grammar, pronunciation, and how you sound, all at the same time. It feels like everything slows down, but your thoughts move very fast. Then I stopped. I took a small breath. I said the same thing again, but this time with fewer words. Very simple, very clear. And suddenly, it worked. The person understood. They smiled and said thank you. Nothing dramatic happened. Nobody was angry. Nobody judged me. The moment passed quietly, but inside, I learned something important. When we feel nervous, we often add too much. Too many words. Too many explanations. But real-life English is often very simple. Later, when I thought about this situation, I smiled because it reminded me that communication is not about perfect sentences. It's about connection. It's about helping each other understand, even when the words are not perfect. These moments are part of everyday life. They happen when we least expect them. And slowly, they help us feel more comfortable, more confident, and more relaxed when we speak. And that's how English becomes part of your life. Not through big moments, but through small, quiet experiences like this one.
Hi everyone, this is Daniel, and we are still together in Calm English, Daily English. Today we are sharing funny everyday situations, and I want to talk about a moment that happened when I was trying to be polite and helpful at the same time. It was a normal evening, and I stopped at a small store after work. I was a little tired, not in a hurry, just ready to go home. I picked up a few things and walked to the counter. Everything was calm. The cashier scanned the items and then asked me a simple question. She asked if I had a loyalty card. I understood the words, but my brain reacted before I had time to think. I said, "Yes." She waited. I waited too. Then she looked at me and said, "Can you show it, please?" And that was the moment when I realized I didn't have one. Not now. Not ever. I had never had a loyalty card in that store, but somehow my mouth had already said yes. I smiled, a little embarrassed, and said, "Oh, sorry, I don't have it." She smiled back and said, "That's okay." The moment passed quickly, but it stayed in my head. Not because it was a big mistake, but because it was such a human one. I didn't lie on purpose. I just answered automatically, politely, without thinking. While she finished the transaction, I thought about how often we do this. We say yes because it feels easier. We don't want to stop the flow. We don't want to sound difficult. But sometimes, the simplest answer is just the truth. When I left the store, I laughed quietly to myself. It was such a small moment, but it said a lot. It reminded me that learning English is not only about words. It's about habits, about reactions, about slowing down enough to let your mind catch up with your mouth. These small situations happen to everyone. Native speakers too. We all answer too fast sometimes. We all correct ourselves. And usually, nobody cares. Life moves on. Later, this moment became another small story. One more example of how learning, speaking, and living are all connected. And how being calm and honest is always better than trying to be perfect.
Hi everyone, this is Natalia, and we're still here together in Calm English, Daily English. Today we're talking about funny everyday situations, and I want to share one more moment that happened when I really wanted to be clear and polite, but my words decided to go their own way. It was a normal day, and I was speaking to someone I didn't know very well. We were having a calm conversation, nothing difficult, just everyday things. At one point, the person told me something personal, not serious, but important to them. I wanted to react kindly. I wanted to show that I understood and cared. In my head, I had a perfect sentence, simple and warm. But when I opened my mouth, a different sentence came out. It sounded much more formal than I wanted, almost cold. The words were correct, but the feeling was wrong. The person looked at me for a second, and I immediately felt it. That moment when you think, "Oh no, that's not what I meant." I smiled and quickly added another sentence. This time very simple. Just a few words. And suddenly the atmosphere changed again. It felt natural. Later, I thought about this moment, about how language is not only about grammar or vocabulary. It's also about tone, about how something sounds. Sometimes we choose words that are technically correct, but they don't sound like us. Comma. This happens a lot when we speak another language. We think too much. We choose safe words, words that feel distant. But real communication is often much simpler. Short sentences, honest reactions, natural pauses. That moment taught me to trust simplicity, to use fewer words, to speak slower, and to remember that it's okay to correct yourself. Saying, sorry, I mean, is not a problem. It's part of real conversation. These small situations help us grow, not only in English, but as people. They remind us to listen, to feel the moment, and to stay present. And slowly, step by step, speaking becomes easier, more natural, more you.
Hi everyone, this is Daniel, and we are still sharing this calm space together in Calm English, Daily English. We are talking about funny everyday situations, the small moments that don't seem important at first, but stay with us because they feel very real. I want to tell you about a situation that happened when I was trying to be polite in a very normal conversation. It was nothing special. I was talking to someone I had just met. We were standing, chatting for a few minutes, exchanging simple information. Everything felt relaxed. At one point, the person said something that surprised me a little. It wasn't bad, just unexpected. I wanted to react naturally, to show interest. In my head, I had many possible answers, but when it was time to speak, my brain chose the wrong one. I said something that sounded too serious, too heavy for the moment. The sentence was correct, but it didn't match the situation. As soon as I said it, I felt it. That small inner pause where you think, that didn't sound right. The other person nodded politely, but the energy changed. Just a little. Enough for me to notice. So I did something simple. I smiled and said, "Sorry, that came out wrong." Then I repeated my thought in a much simpler way, shorter, more honest. And just like that, the moment softened again. The conversation continued naturally. Nothing was broken. Nothing was awkward anymore. It was a small reminder that communication is flexible. We are allowed to adjust. We are allowed to correct ourselves. Later, I thought about how important this is, especially when learning English. We often think that one wrong sentence ruins everything. But in real life, it doesn't. People don't expect perfection. They expect honesty. They expect real reactions. These situations teach us to slow down, to listen not only to words, but to the moment itself, to notice how something feels, not just how it sounds. And when something feels wrong, it's okay to change it. Funny everyday situations are not really about being funny. They are about learning, about awareness, about becoming more comfortable with ourselves in conversation. And every time we go through one of these moments, we become a little more relaxed, a little more confident. And that's how speaking English slowly becomes easier. Not by avoiding mistakes, but by living through them calmly.
Hi everyone, this is Natalia, and we're still together in Calm English, Daily English. We're sharing funny everyday situations, and I want to talk about something that happens very often, especially when we want to be polite and kind. This situation happened during a very ordinary conversation. I was speaking to someone I didn't know very well. We were talking calmly, exchanging small details about our day. Nothing serious. Just friendly small talk. At one moment, the person told me they were tired. Not very tired, just a little. I wanted to answer in a warm and supportive way. In my head, I had many ideas. I wanted to say something nice, something simple. But when I spoke, my sentence came out much longer than it needed to be. I started explaining, giving advice, talking about rest, sleep, and time. I kept talking, and while I was speaking, I suddenly realized something. The person didn't need all this. They just wanted a simple reaction. I stopped myself. I smiled and said, "Sorry, I talk too much sometimes." The person laughed. The moment became lighter. Later, I thought about this situation and smiled because it showed me something important. Sometimes we think we need to say more to sound friendly, but often less is better. A short sentence, a calm tone, a simple response. In English, this is especially important. We often add extra words because we are nervous. We want to sound correct. We want to sound confident. But real communication doesn't need long explanations. A simple "I understand." A simple that makes sense. A simple "I'm sorry you feel tired." These small sentences are powerful. They sound natural. They feel real. This moment reminded me that calm English is not about speaking a lot. It's about speaking clearly, about choosing simple words and letting silence exist. Silence is not a problem. Silence is part of conversation. Funny, everyday situations often teach us this. They gently show us where we can relax, where we can slow down, where we can trust ourselves a little more. And step by step, these moments help us feel more comfortable speaking English. Not perfect English, just real, human English.
Hi everyone, this is Daniel, and we are still here together in Calm English, Daily English. We are talking about funny everyday situations, and I want to share a moment that taught me something simple, but very important. This happened during a normal conversation at work. Nothing stressful. Just a short talk with someone I see often. We were discussing a small task, something routine. Everything was clear in my head. I knew what I wanted to say. But when it was my turn to speak, my sentence came out differently. The words were correct, but the order was strange. Not wrong, just confusing. I saw it immediately in the other person's face. That look people get when they are listening, but not fully following. Instead of stopping, I kept talking. I thought I could fix it by adding more words. But the more I spoke, the less clear it became. I was building a long sentence, hoping it would suddenly make sense. Finally, I stopped. I smiled and said, "Let me say that again." Then I started over, slowly, with fewer words. And it worked. The other person nodded and said, "Yes, now I understand." That moment stayed with me, because it showed me something very clear. When we speak English, especially when we are nervous, we often think that more words will help, but very often they don't. Fewer words are stronger. Clear words are better. Later that day, I thought about how many times we do this. We feel pressure. We want to sound fluent. We want to sound smart. So we rush. And when we rush, we lose clarity. Funny everyday situations like this are not really about mistakes. They are about learning how to slow down. how to trust simple language, how to give yourself permission to start again. Saying, "Let me say that again," is not a weakness. It's a skill. It shows awareness. It shows calm. And people respect that. These moments help us grow more comfortable speaking English. They remind us that real communication is not perfect. It's flexible. It allows pauses, corrections, and restarts. And over time, these small lessons become habits. You speak slower. You choose simpler words. You feel more relaxed. And English starts to feel like a natural part of your daily life.
Hi everyone, this is Natalia, and we're still spending this calm time together in Calm English, Daily English. We're sharing funny everyday situations, and I want to talk about a moment that showed me how easily we can misunderstand each other, even in very simple situations. This happened when I was trying to be very polite and careful. I was meeting someone for the first time. Nothing formal, just a normal meeting. We sat down, talked a little, and everything felt comfortable. The conversation was light, easy, and friendly. At one point, the person asked me a simple question. It was not difficult at all. I understood it clearly. But instead of answering directly, I started thinking. I thought about how to answer correctly. I wanted my English to sound nice, calm, friendly. While I was thinking, there was a small pause, just a few seconds, but it felt longer in my head. I felt the pressure growing, so I answered quickly, too quickly. The answer was not wrong, but it was not exactly what I meant. The other person nodded, but I could feel that something was missing. The meeting was close, but not complete. So I did something simple. I smiled and said, "Actually, let me explain that a little better." Then I said the same thing again, but in a much simpler way. Short sentences, clear words, and suddenly the conversation felt right again. The other person smiled and said, "Oh, I see." That small moment of clarity felt very good. Later, I thought about this situation and realized how often we do this. We rush because we feel pressure. We want to sound good. We want to sound confident, but confidence doesn't come from speed. It comes from calmness. Funny, everyday situations like this teach us to slow down, to trust simple language, to remember that we are allowed to take our time. We are allowed to think. We are allowed to correct ourselves. These moments don't make us weaker speakers. They make us stronger, because every time we choose clarity over speed, we become more comfortable, more natural, more ourselves, and slowly English stops feeling like something we perform. It becomes something we simply use. In real life, in real moments, with real people.
Hi everyone, this is Daniel, and we are still here with Calm English, Daily English. We are sharing funny everyday situations, and I want to talk about a moment that taught me how small misunderstandings can turn into something surprisingly positive. This happened during a very ordinary conversation. I was talking to someone I see quite often. We were discussing simple plans, nothing serious. The conversation was easy, relaxed, and friendly. Then the person said something that I understood, but not completely. I thought I knew what they meant, so I answered based on my assumption. I nodded, smiled, and responded confidently. In my head, everything made sense. But a few seconds later, I realized from their reaction that we were not talking about the same thing. There was a short pause. Not an uncomfortable one, just quiet. In that pause, I had a choice. I could continue pretending that everything was clear, or I could stop and check. So I stopped and said, "Wait, I think I misunderstood." I asked a short, simple question to clarify. The other person smiled and said, "Oh, yes, I meant something else." And just like that, the confusion disappeared. The interesting part was how easy it was to fix. No tension, no embarrassment, just two people adjusting their understanding. The conversation continued naturally, as if nothing had happened. Later, I thought about how often we avoid moments like this. We are afraid of looking confused. We are afraid of interrupting. But in reality, these small pauses are very normal. They help communication. They make it clearer, not worse. Funny everyday situations often remind us that language is flexible. It's not a test. It's a tool. And tools sometimes need adjustment. We can stop. We can ask again. We can change direction. These moments slowly build confidence. Not because we never misunderstand, but because we learn how to handle misunderstandings calmly. We learn that it's okay to slow down, to check, to ask. And over time, English stops feeling fragile. It feels stable. Something you can use, even when it's not perfect. Especially when it's not perfect.
Hi everyone, this is Natalia, and we're still here together in Calm English, Daily English. We're sharing funny everyday situations, and I want to talk about a moment that reminded me how easily our intentions and our words can go in different directions. This happened during a very normal conversation with someone I know quite well. We were talking about plans, about everyday things, nothing serious. The mood was light, friendly, comfortable. I felt relaxed, so I wasn't paying much attention to my words. I was just speaking. At one point, I wanted to agree with something the other person said. In my head, it was very clear. I wanted to say, "Yes, that sounds good to me." A simple sentence, easy, but what I actually said sounded much stronger than I intended. It sounded like a final decision, not just agreement. The other person reacted immediately. They started talking about details, next steps, and timing. I listened and slowly realized that my words had created a different meaning. I hadn't meant to decide anything. I had only meant to show support. For a moment, I felt unsure. Should I let it go? Should I correct myself? I didn't want to seem confusing. But then I remembered something important. Clear communication is always better than silent confusion. So I gently stopped the conversation and said, "I think I didn't explain myself very well." Then I repeated my thought, but this time with fewer words and a calmer tone. I explained what I really meant. The other person smiled and said, "Ah, okay. Now I understand." Just like that, everything was clear again. Later, I thought about how often this happens, especially when we speak another language. We choose words that feel strong or safe, but they don't always match our real intention. And that's okay. What matters is noticing it and adjusting. Funny, everyday situations like this teach us to listen to ourselves, to hear how we sound, and to remember that it's always possible to clarify, to soften, to explain again. These moments don't mean we failed. They mean we are learning. And every time we correct ourselves calmly, we build more trust in our communication. Over time, English becomes less stressful, less heavy. It becomes something we can use gently, honestly, and naturally. And that's when speaking starts to feel easier.
Hi everyone, this is Daniel, and we are still here together in Calm English, Daily English. We are sharing funny everyday situations, and I want to talk about a moment that showed me how easily we can misread a situation, even when everyone has good intentions. This happened during a very simple interaction. I was meeting someone for a short conversation. Nothing important. Nothing formal, just a normal exchange of information. We were standing, talking calmly, and everything felt relaxed. At one point, the person asked me a question. It was an open question, not difficult, but it required a clear answer. I understood the words, but I wasn't sure what the person really wanted to know. Instead of asking for clarification, I chose one interpretation and answered confidently. As I spoke, I noticed the other person listening very carefully. They nodded, but their expression changed slightly. Not negative, just thoughtful. I continued talking, adding details, trying to be helpful. But with every sentence, I felt that the connection was slowly drifting away. Then there was a pause. A natural pause. And in that pause, I realized something important. I was answering a question that was never asked. I had gone in the wrong direction, not because my English was bad, but because I assumed instead of checking. So I stopped. I smiled and said, "Let me make sure I understand you correctly." Then I asked a short question. Very simple. The other person smiled back and said, "Yes, that's exactly what I meant." Suddenly, everything came back into focus. The conversation became easy again, clear, natural. Later, I thought about how often this happens in everyday life. We assume we know what the other person means. We rush to answer. We want to be efficient. But sometimes, one small check saves a lot of confusion. Funny everyday situations like this remind us that communication is not about speed. It's about connection. It's about listening carefully and giving ourselves permission to pause. These moments teach us patience, with ourselves and with others. They show us that it's okay to slow down, to ask, to adjust. Nothing is lost by doing that. In fact, a lot is gained. Over time, experiences like this help us feel more comfortable speaking English. We stop trying to be perfect. We focus on understanding and being understood. And that's when communication starts to feel calm, real, and human.
Hi everyone, this is Natalia, and we're still together in Calm English, Daily English. We're sharing funny, everyday situations. And I want to talk about a moment that taught me how silence can sometimes feel louder than words. This happened during a very simple conversation. I was talking to someone I respect. The topic was easy, nothing personal, nothing serious. We were just sharing thoughts, calmly, one after another. Everything felt comfortable. At one point, the person asked me a question. I understood it. I really did. But I needed a second to think. Just 1 second. And instead of allowing myself that second, I panicked a little. I felt that pressure to answer immediately to keep the conversation moving. So I spoke too fast. The sentence came out unfinished. The idea was there, but the words didn't fully follow it. I stopped in the middle, realized what happened, and felt that familiar feeling again. That small inner voice saying, that didn't sound right. There was a short silence, just a few seconds, but in my head, it felt much longer. I could feel my thoughts racing. Should I continue? Should I stop? Should I explain? Then I did something very simple. I smiled and said, "Sorry, I need a moment." I took a breath, and then I said the same idea again, slowly, clearly. Nothing bad happened. The person listened. They nodded. The conversation continued naturally. The silence didn't break anything. It helped. Later, I thought about this moment and realized how important it was. Silence is not a problem. Pauses are not mistakes. They are part of communication. They give us space to think, to choose better words, to speak more honestly. Funny, everyday situations like this remind us that we don't need to rush, especially in another language. We are allowed to take our time. We are allowed to pause. We are allowed to breathe. These moments slowly change how we speak. We become calmer, more confident. We stop fighting silence and start using it. And when that happens, English feels less stressful, less heavy, more natural. And that's how learning becomes part of life, quietly, gently, one small moment at a time.
Hi everyone, this is Daniel, and we are still here in Calm English, Daily English. We are talking about funny everyday situations, and I want to share a moment that showed me how easily we can misunderstand tone, not words. This happened during a friendly conversation. Nothing serious. We were talking about plans, about everyday things, and everything felt relaxed. I wanted to make a small joke, a very light one, the kind of joke you make without thinking too much. In my head, it sounded friendly, warm, normal, but when I said it out loud, the tone was different. Not rude, not bad, just flat, without emotion. I noticed it immediately, but it was already said. The other person smiled, but the smile was polite, not relaxed. And in that moment, I understood that the joke didn't land the way I expected. Not because the words were wrong, but because the tone didn't match the intention. For a second, I thought about letting it go, pretending nothing happened. But instead, I chose something simpler. I smiled and said, "Sorry, that sounded better in my head." The other person laughed. The tension disappeared. That small sentence changed everything. It didn't explain the joke. It didn't fix the words. It just acknowledged the moment. And that was enough. Later, I thought about how important tone is, especially in another language. We often focus on grammar, vocabulary, correct sentences. But communication is more than that. It's how something sounds, how it feels. Funny everyday situations like this remind us that we don't have to get everything right. We can notice a moment and gently adjust. We can smile. We can add a short explanation. Or we can simply move on. These moments help us become more aware. We start listening not only to others, but to ourselves. to our voice, to our rhythm, and slowly we learn how to sound more natural, more relaxed. Learning English is not about performing perfectly. It's about being present, about connecting, about allowing small mistakes and small corrections. And when we do that, speaking becomes easier, more human. And that's how calm English grows. Through small moments, small laughs, and simple honesty.
Hi everyone, this is Natalia, and we're still here in Calm English, Daily English. We're sharing funny everyday situations, and I want to talk about a moment that taught me how easily habits take control when we are nervous. This happened in a very familiar place, a place I had been to many times before. I knew what to do. I knew how things worked there. Everything should have been simple, and that's exactly why it became funny. I walked in, greeted the person at the desk, and waited. When it was my turn, they asked me a basic question, a question I had answered many times before. I opened my mouth and answered automatically. The words came out fast, confident, without thinking. The person looked at me and paused. Just a short pause. Then they asked the same question again, but in a slightly different way. And suddenly, I realized something. My automatic answer didn't really fit this time. I had answered out of habit, not out of attention. I smiled and said, "Sorry, let me think for a second." I took a breath and answered again. This time, slowly. This time, correctly. Nothing bad happened. The person nodded, typed something, and the situation moved on. But inside, I was smiling because it reminded me how often we run on autopilot, especially when we speak another language. We learn phrases. We learn patterns, and that's good. But sometimes we use them without checking if they really match the moment. Funny, everyday situations like this gently remind us to stay present, to listen fully, to answer consciously. Later, I thought about how this applies to learning English. It's not only about knowing the right phrases. It's about knowing when to use them, about feeling the situation, about being flexible. These small moments help us slow down. They show us that it's okay to pause. It's okay to correct yourself. It's okay to step out of autopilot and choose your words again. And when we allow ourselves to do that, English starts to feel lighter. Less mechanical, more alive, more connected to who we are in the moment. That's how real communication grows. Not through perfection, but through attention, through calm awareness, through small adjustments that make a big difference.
Hi everyone, this is Daniel, and we are still sharing this calm space together in Calm English. Daily English. We are talking about funny everyday situations, and I want to tell you about a moment that happened when I thought I was listening very carefully, but actually I wasn't. This happened during a normal conversation with someone I work with. We were talking about plans for the next day. Nothing complicated. I was nodding, listening, reacting. Everything felt smooth. I thought I understood everything perfectly. At one point, the person asked me a short question. I answered right away, confidently, without hesitation. It felt good, clear, easy. But then they stopped and looked at me for a second. Not confused, not surprised, just thoughtful. And then they said, "That's not what I asked." That sentence always feels a little funny, because in that moment, you realize something important. You were listening, but only halfway. You heard the words, but your mind was already preparing an answer. I laughed and said, "Oh, sorry. Can you say that again?" They repeated the question, slowly, and this time I really listened. I didn't think about my answer. I just listened. And suddenly, everything made sense. The second answer was much simpler, shorter, more natural, and it fit perfectly. The conversation continued without any problem. Later, I thought about this moment and smiled, because it reminded me how often we do this. We think listening means waiting for our turn to speak, but real listening means staying present until the other person finishes. Funny everyday situations like this teach us patience. They remind us that silence while listening is not awkward. It's useful. It gives us information. It helps us respond better. In another language, this is even more important. We feel pressure to answer quickly, to show we understand. But understanding grows when we slow down, not when we rush. These moments help us become better speakers, not because we talk more, but because we listen better. And when listening improves, speaking becomes easier too. Over time, English stops feeling like something we have to control. It becomes something we share, something we use naturally, in real moments, with real people. And that's when learning feels calm, light, human.
Hi everyone, this is Natalia, and we're still together in Calm English, Daily English. We're talking about funny everyday situations, and I want to share a moment that showed me how easily our emotions can speak faster than our words. This happened during a very normal day. I was having a calm conversation with someone. Nothing serious, nothing emotional. We were just talking about plans and small details. Everything felt easy and relaxed. I felt comfortable, so I wasn't paying close attention to how I sounded. At one point, the person asked me a question that surprised me a little. Not in a bad way, just unexpectedly. And without thinking, I reacted emotionally instead of calmly. My answer was fast, too fast. The words were correct, but the tone was stronger than I wanted. As soon as I finished speaking, I felt it. That small inner moment when you think. That sounded different in my head. The other person didn't react badly, but I could sense that my tone had changed the feeling of the conversation. I paused for a second. I smiled and said, "Sorry, that came out too strong." Then I said the same thing again, but slowly with a softer tone. And just like that, everything felt normal again. Later, I thought about this moment and realized how important tone is in everyday communication, especially in another language. Sometimes we focus so much on saying the right words that we forget how they sound. But tone carries meaning too, sometimes even more than words. Funny, everyday situations like this teach us awareness. They remind us to check in with ourselves, to notice how we feel when we speak, and to remember that it's always okay to adjust. These moments help us grow not only as English learners, but as communicators. We become more sensitive, more present, more calm, and slowly speaking English feels less stressful. We trust ourselves more. We allow space for small corrections, And we understand that real communication is flexible. It moves, it changes. That's how Calm English becomes part of daily life, not through perfect sentences, but through honest moments and gentle adjustments.
Hi everyone, this is Daniel, and we are still here in Calm English, Daily English. We are talking about funny everyday situations, and I want to share a moment that happened when I tried to be efficient and learned that efficiency is not always helpful. This happened during a normal day when I had many small things to do. I was moving fast, thinking ahead, planning the next step before finishing the current one. I felt productive, confident, in control. I walked into a place where I needed some information. I knew what I wanted to ask. I had already prepared the question in my head. When it was my turn, I started speaking immediately. I didn't wait. I didn't pause. I spoke quickly, clearly, and confidently. The person listened politely, nodded, and then asked me a very simple question in return. It was a short question, easy to answer, but because I was already thinking about my next task, I answered without really listening. The answer didn't fit. I saw it in their face right away. Not confusion, not irritation, just a gentle pause. That pause told me everything. I had missed something important. I stopped and said, "Sorry, can you repeat that?" They repeated the question, calmly. This time, I listened fully, and suddenly, the correct answer was obvious. Simple, natural. The whole situation took less than a minute, but it stayed with me much longer, because it showed me how often we rush through conversations without being fully present. We want to save time. We want to be efficient. But communication doesn't always work that way. Funny everyday situations like this remind us that slowing down is not a weakness. It's a skill. When we slow down, we listen better. We respond better. And conversations feel easier. Especially in another language, presence matters more than speed. You don't need fast answers. You need clear ones. And clarity comes from attention, not from rushing. These moments gently teach us to pause, to listen, to let the conversation unfold at its own pace. And when we do that, English feels calmer, more natural, less demanding. Over time, learning becomes less about effort and more about awareness. And that's when English truly becomes part of everyday life.